This morning, our scripture reading will be looking at what has been called the story of the Prodigal Son. It's probably one of the best known parables. It has been called the greatest short story in the world. It's been written about, it's been analyzed, and it's been portrayed in artwork over all these years. Now, the challenge of hearing a familiar story such as this is to listen for something new each time that you hear it. When we hear this story, what title do you give it? Do you call it the Prodigal Son? Do you call it the Tale of Two Brothers? Or do we call the story the Waiting Father? Thinking about it, all of these aptly apply to it because depending on where we are in life, we can clearly see ourselves in any of these roles. And also the story, it's not like our modern television shows where problem is resolved in a half hour. At the end of this story, we are left wondering what will happen next. And that's precisely where we enter into this picture. How will we, as prodigal or faithful, respond to God's love and mercy? Listen to the story again. Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 3 and 11 through 32. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." And so he divided the property between his two sons. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, and he set off for a distant country. And there, he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. Now he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. I'll set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and he kissed him. This son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened cow and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost, now he is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, 'What's going on?' 'Your brother has come home,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' Now the older brother became angry and he refused to go in. So his father went out and he pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I can celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered his property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost, and now he is found." This is the word of God, the people of God. The painter Rembrandt struggled with where he fit into this story. And so I think this morning it would be kind of interesting for us also to examine and look to see where we might fit into this story. Would you be the father, the older son, or the younger son? In one of Rembrandt's classic paintings, he tries to depict this wonderful parable of Jesus. It captures the scene of the son on his knees with the father embracing him, and the oldest son standing off to the side with a look of disgust. Well, there's a story behind this painting, and it has to do with the life of Rembrandt himself. Rembrandt often would paint himself into his artwork. His face would appear on one of the characters. In this particular painting, Rembrandt painted himself as the father who embraces his wayward son. He completed this piece of work towards the end of his life, when his eyesight was failing and his body was crippled. In the painting, you can see his far-off look and the stiffness in his fingers. The embrace is warm and gentle. So this morning, let us think about ourselves in relationship to this story. See which character we identify with most. First off, many of us can probably identify with the prodigal son. I know I can. At some point in our lives, I suppose most of us can remember when we ran away to explore the far-off country. We remember the rebellion and sins of our youth. We look with regret at some of the things that we've done. Like this prodigal son, some of the mistakes we made had life-changing consequences. We look back on our actions with remorse. This was the case for Rembrandt in his early life. He was not always conscious of his need for God. His biographers tell of a proud and arrogant young man who had no moral values. He lived a sensuous life and he loved fame and luxury. He spent all the money he made from his paintings, plus some. When he was 30 years old, he painted himself and his current wife as the prodigal son and a prostitute in a brothel. At this point in his life, he identified not with the father, but with the prodigal. Here he sits in the painting with a loose woman on his lap and a large glass of ale half gone. There's this drunken look on his face and the curtain is half drawn. He has this look of arrogance with his long flowing hair and a velvet cap and a huge white feather. By his side, he wears a sword with a golden handle. He is now in that faraway land, spending his inheritance. Later on in his life, his cavalier lifestyle will destroy him. His popularity as a painter plunged and his critics grew. He came to a financial crisis and he had to sell his large collection of paintings, his vast accumulation of artifacts, his furniture, and even his home. 3 auctions wiped out his wealth. Several marriages and many relationships failed. Most of his children died. when he died in 1669, he was a poor and lonely man. But the experience of life seemed to deepen him rather than embitter him. His paintings began to take on a new depth and warmth. Light came from interior sources. The colors are richer and the themes are nobler. In the painting of the Return of the Prodigal Son, we see a young man whose head is shaved, a sign of slavery. Gone is the long flowing hair that once crowned Rembrandt's head. There's no hat, no feather, no fine clothes. Filthy rags barely cover his body, and what's left of his shoes are falling off his feet. He's on his knees weeping as he is embraced by the Father. Most of us have been there at one time or another. We eventually find ourselves wandering back home, back to the Father, knowing that we're not worthy of his forgiveness. And yet the good news of the gospel is that the Father insists on embracing us as sons and daughters. Now there's another person in this story with whom it may be a little more difficult to identify with. And that would be the older brother. This is the child who never did anything wrong and always pleased their parents. The elder brother in Jesus' day could have been portrayed as the Pharisees. They were the good people, and they felt that they were better than the common sinners. They deserved special treatment from their father. They understood the rules, but they did not understand what it meant to have a relationship with the Father. They thought they deserved God's love because they had earned it. They had it coming. God owed them. But they never understood that what God was after was not their obedience, but their heart. Now, it occurred to me as I continued to think about this parable that the older brother was just as far away from home as the younger brother was. He looked on himself as his father's slave. Listen as he says, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders." I began to realize how difficult it would be for the older brother to do what the prodigal younger brother did. To fall on his knees and say, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." Instead, he says he's never disobeyed his father's orders. That may be correct, but the problem was he saw his relationship with his father as a matter of obeying orders. He obeyed the father, but he had never responded to his father's love or given him a place in his heart. Imagine this moral and responsible man falling on his knees, burying his head in his father's chest and saying that he's unworthy to be called a son. It's almost unthinkable. He had done nothing wrong. He had not sinned against heaven or his father in his own mind. He certainly could not see that he was not worthy to be called a son. That's precisely what he needed to do, because his heart was not one with the Father. He wanted to be good so he could be proud of who he was and what he had done. Not because he loved the Father and wanted to be like him, but because he was obeying orders. Now, besides the two brothers, there's also the other person to identify with, and that would be the father. Eventually, every son must grow up to be a father himself. Eventually, every son must grow up and have the responsibility of leading the household. Eventually, this young son would have young sons of his own. The time would come when he would have to embrace them after they had rebelled and wanted to return home. This one who received grace and forgiveness would be able to give grace and forgiveness because he had seen it modeled from his father. Because he learned what his father was like, he'd be able to forgive, to extend grace, to welcome his child home and embrace him. When we grow up spiritually, we must be careful that we do not become like the older brother, but let us become more like the Father. The time comes when, because we have been comforted, we are the ones who give comfort. We are the ones who seek the lost. We are looking for them while they're still a far way off. We're longing for them to come home. We are here for those who have failed and are tired, are disappointed, guilty, and ashamed. This is our inheritance from the Father. And this is why the older son also squandered his inheritance, because he never spent his love. Even though it was so perfectly modeled by his father, he did not spend it wildly. Rather, he never spent it at all. He kept it carefully locked up inside of him. He wasted his inheritance because he never used his inheritance. So where do you find yourself today in this picture? Shakespeare said that the wise man knows himself to be a fool, and the fool thinks he is a wise man. Let me rephrase that and say, the wise person knows when he is lost, understands the source of his homesickness, and returns to a Father who loves him. The great English preacher P.T. Forsyth once said, "The only way to the Father is through the far country." Must this far country be moral disillusion? It could be, but in reality, the far country is the place where you become disillusioned with who you are. You are in the far country at the point where you are disappointed with the world and you say, "Is this all there is?" And the Father then says to you, "Of course not. Come home." Amen. This morning,